It began in the most ordinary way, the kind of moment seasoned professionals recognize instantly. A late Friday message appeared on my screen, the tone polite but familiar, another request to handle an entire weekend of work without compensation. I read it twice, not because I was uncertain, but because I knew the decision I was about to make carried weight. After years of cooperation, I answered with calm clarity. I explained that I would not be available this time. No raised voice. No hostility. Only a firm and respectful limit that should have been understood. Monday arrived with a quiet chill. I walked toward the building expecting nothing unusual, but my badge stopped at the sensor, the indicator light frozen. I tried again, slower, thinking it might be a simple malfunction. The door remained closed. Security approached with puzzled faces, checking their monitor and asking if I had recently changed departments. I felt a faint tightening in my chest, not anger, but recognition. While they made calls, my phone began buzzing. System alerts. Build failures. Time jobs waiting for authentication. The kind of disruptions that never occur together unless something deeper has shifted. I stepped aside and watched each alert appear with a rhythm that felt intentional. Still, I said nothing. I waited, observing patterns I knew by heart. Colleagues inside the building started sending messages, asking if I was logged in. They assumed I was working remotely. They had no idea my access had vanished. In that quiet hallway, surrounded by confusion that did not come from me, the truth settled. This was not an access problem. It was a message. I had spent years shaping a role that was never loud but always essential. My presence touched every part of the system without needing announcements or explanations. I understood how each component breathed and how each process depended on the one before it. People often walked past my desk without realizing that the stability they enjoyed rested on a foundation I had quietly maintained. My credentials did far more than unlock a door in the morning. They verified internal pipelines that carried code through long chains of operations. They triggered scheduled builds at hours when most of the company slept. They allowed nightly automations to move forward without hesitation or interruption. These tasks were routine only because they had been designed with precision, and that precision came from years of experience. Everything was documented, but documentation alone does not replace ownership. I was the one who understood why certain exceptions existed, why certain sequences had to remain untouched, why certain triggers could not be reorganized. It was not a secret. Management knew exactly how the system functioned. They also knew how much of it relied on my presence. When they revoked my badge, they believed they were removing an inconvenience. They assumed I would feel embarrassed, disconnected, and powerless. They believed the structure would bend easily and that the system would continue to run on habit. They looked at access as a simple administrative switch and treated it as a form of discipline. What they did not understand was the lesson every experienced professional learns at some point. A structure always remembers the hands that built it. The first signs appeared quietly, the way real trouble often begins. A scheduled task failed to launch, and someone in the team brushed it off as a temporary glitch. A few minutes later, another automated job stalled. By mid-morning, deadlines that had seemed manageable began slipping one by one. What they believed was a minor interruption slowly revealed itself as something far more serious. Engineers rushed toward their consoles, trying to restart processes that had never needed attention before. Logs began showing a pattern that none of them wanted to see. Every failure pointed back to revoked credentials, the very ones tied to the systems that kept the entire pipeline alive. The realization spread quickly. No one possessed the complete keychain that held the structure together. Meetings were called as soon as the issues multiplied. People filled conference rooms with laptops open and voices rising with frustration. Tasks piled up, but none of them progressed. The screens told the same story in different ways. Each attempt to push a release ended in the same silent refusal. The system waited for authorization it no longer recognized. Leadership grew tense as pressure mounted from clients and internal teams. Questions came from every direction. Why is nothing moving? Who changed the configuration? When will the system recover? The answers were unclear because the decision that triggered the collapse had never been examined. Through all of this activity, I was nowhere near the building. I watched the alerts from a distance, knowing exactly what each one meant and understanding why the team could not find a solution. Systems do not fail loudly. They fail precisely. I sat at my desk and opened a new message window. The cursor blinked as if expecting a declaration, a demand, or at least an explanation. I began typing a clear account of what had happened, outlining the sequence of events that started with the revoked access. The words formed easily because the facts were simple. As I reread the message, I felt no urgency. I also realized I did not need to send it. I deleted the draft and leaned back in my chair. There was nothing to accuse. There was nothing to warn. My contract already described the responsibilities attached to my role, and the audit trail documented every action taken by the system. The situation did not require my commentary. It required patience. In the past, I might have reacted quickly, trying to correct misunderstandings before they spread. With time, experience teaches something different. A structure reveals its own mistakes when left to operate without guidance. My silence was not avoidance. It was a choice based on clarity. I understood exactly what had been set in motion. Hours passed, and the calls began. Managers looked for explanations. Teams searched for a missing piece. Leadership questioned timelines. I responded only when necessary, and only with information that belonged to the official record. The absence of emotion created a tone they did not expect, and that tone carried more authority than any argument could have produced. They noticed my silence not because it was dramatic, but because the systems they depended on had stopped responding altogether. Nothing moved until the truth surfaced, and the truth did not come from me. It came from the consequences they created themselves. The call from HR arrived late in the afternoon, timed carefully, as if they needed a moment to choose the right tone. Their voice carried a level of restraint that had not been present earlier in the week. They did not call to offer an apology or to inquire about my experience at the door. They called for one reason only. They needed to understand the extent of the exposure created by the decision to revoke my access. The questions began slowly, each one building on the last. They asked about the documentation that supported the systems I had maintained. They asked about the ownership of the sequences that controlled nightly operations. They asked about exceptions, permissions, and the relationship between my credentials and the automations the company depended on. It became clear that their concern was no longer the inconvenience of a blocked badge. Their concern was liability. I answered calmly, offering only the information required by each question. Nothing more. Nothing interpretive. Years of experience had taught me to separate emotion from procedure. My clarity made them pause, and the silence between their questions became longer each time they realized how little room remained for assumptions. They searched for any indication that my lack of access was connected to personal conflict. I provided none. They searched for signs of retaliation. There were none. What they saw instead was a direct consequence of their own administrative action colliding with the structure of their internal systems. By the end of the call, the shift was undeniable. This situation was no longer about ego. It was no longer about control. It had become a moment where compliance met reality, and reality did not bend for intention. While I continued my work from a distance, a meeting unfolded behind closed doors inside the building. I was not invited, yet every detail of what happened reached me later through the quiet channels that exist in any organization. Leadership gathered around a long table, and legal occupied the seats closest to them. The atmosphere shifted quickly from confidence to uncertainty as the depth of the disruption became clear. Screens displayed timelines, logs, and failed executions. Each point of failure traced back to the single administrative action taken earlier in the week. Legal reviewed the records with steady attention, confirming the sequence of events and the origin of the collapse. There was no space for speculation. The documentation spoke for itself. At some moment during that discussion, someone finally voiced the conclusion everyone had avoided. Revoking my access had triggered the failure. It was not an unpredictable malfunction. It was not an error created by external forces. It was the direct result of a decision made without understanding the structure it affected. The room fell silent as this realization settled across the table. Once the truth was spoken, the tone inside the meeting changed entirely. Leadership shifted from frustration to concern. The story they had been telling themselves began to dissolve. No narrative about attitude or resistance could withstand the evidence displayed on the screen. The consequences did not come from emotion. They came from the architecture they had overlooked. By the end of the meeting, it was clear they were not confronting a rebellious employee. They were confronting their own choices, amplified by a system that could not function without the access they had removed. The restoration of my access arrived through an official message, crafted carefully to sound procedural rather than apologetic. My badge worked again by the next morning. A brief green light appeared on the sensor, and the door opened as if nothing had happened. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations paused when I walked by, and people monitored my expression the way one observes a fault line after a tremor. Once my credentials returned, the pipeline began to recover piece by piece. Automated jobs resumed their cycles. Builds that had stalled for hours completed without resistance. Releases moved forward, not quickly, but steadily enough to calm the immediate tension. The system exhaled after days of strain. Yet beneath that relief, something far more permanent had shifted. Trust had fractured in ways no technical fix could mend. Leadership no longer spoke with the same certainty. The authority they relied on had cracked, not because of confrontation, but because the system had revealed the truth they had ignored. The quiet arrogance that once guided their decisions no longer held its shape. Everyone understood how easily their confidence had failed under pressure. I did not mark the moment with celebration. Years of experience teach that a return to normal does not mean a return to stability. Instead, I updated my resume with steady hands. I listed achievements, responsibilities, and the systems I had designed. I prepared for possibilities they had never considered. As I closed the document, the lesson stood clear. I did not crash their system. I exposed who actually held it together. If you are over 50, I want you to hear this with the calm certainty that comes from a lifetime of experience. You have already learned that value is not proven in noise. It is woven into structures, into choices, into the way systems behave when pressure arrives. Experience does not announce itself or demand attention. It integrates quietly until the moment someone tries to function without it. In every workplace, there are people who believe that access equals power. They hold the keys, they control the badges, and they imagine that authority comes from the ability to open and close doors. Seasoned professionals understand something entirely different. True influence comes from understanding how the environment operates, how processes depend on each other, and how small actions shape the stability of an entire organization. Do not waste energy arguing with individuals who measure strength by control panels and permissions. Redirect your focus toward the structure itself. Strength comes from clarity, documentation, and the confidence to stand by your boundaries without raising your voice. When you set limits with calm intention, you protect your future and reveal the gaps that others overlook. Document everything. Protect your knowledge. Let systems and timelines speak for you. A quiet record carries more power than any heated conversation. A consistent pattern of integrity holds longer than any moment of confrontation. With age comes the ability to let consequences unfold without interference. Remember this truth. People who mistake authority for competence eventually confront the results of their own decisions. The moment always comes when access is not enough and knowledge becomes essential. People who confuse authority with access eventually lock themselves out.